Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about Beowulf and the Wife's Lament. All right, so talking about Beowulf. So, one of the things that's kind of hard about talking about the history of Beowulf is that we really don't know exactly when this was written or even when it was when it was originated, right? And so we don't have the author. We don't really know a whole lot about it, despite a lot of effort. And so there is speculation. There's a lot of research that's been done to support different dates and things like that. But what we sort of know is that it's based on events, places, people in the 6th century. Um, and, we can kind of recognize those references. Um, there's no Beowulf as far as we can tell, but some of the other people and places and things seem like they're referencing real people. It was written as early as the first half of the 8th century, according to some, but it sounds like most people agree that it was actually written later. Okay, and so we only have one surviving manuscript of Beowulf, and that's going to be really forming the assumptions that we make, right? And fortunately, it was damaged in a fire. Fortunately, most of it survived. And so we do have a lot of information based on that, that manuscript, but, we can't know everything. Despite not knowing everything, we do know that this is probably the earliest European vernacular epic that has survived, at least. In other words, it's using a language or dialect native to a region or country rather than a literary, cultured, or foreign language, right? And so usually people were writing in another language than the vernacular. And then this is an example of people actually writing in the vernacular. And so that's why we're talking about it. It was probably shared through oral storytelling before it was written down. And I think despite disagreements about the origins of this poem, that's almost certainly true. To the extent as maybe where we can disagree, because this has so many elements that seem to suggest like an earlier time period or that it's coming from different traditions and things like that. That it seems like it was probably like shared in different ways before it was written down. Um, but again, we can't know everything. I wish. Plot. So one thing that we do know is the plot. The first major kind of exciting part of the plot is that Grendel is a monster who goes to Heorot and he attacks Hrothgar's men and, is just kind of this like terror where they're trying to just party and have a good time. And Grendel keeps coming and ruining things, from their perspective. And Beowulf comes and he is able to defeat Grendel. He rips his arm off with his bare hands, which is pretty gross. And then, Grendel goes back to his den and dies. Grendel's mom seeks revenge for her child's death. And she is also defeated by Beowulf. And so, Beowulf is really that hero, right? Much later. So he, lives this like kind of almost I like picture like Ulysses or something. He's living this long, peaceful rule, and a dragon starts to cause problems because somebody stole a cup. And at this point, Beowulf is like much older, but he is still this monster hunter, right? And so he goes and he defeats this dragon, but he is injured so severely that he dies, and basically passes the gauntlet, right? All right. So when we're thinking about the language and form of Beowulf, we're gonna see a lot of the same things that we've seen from the other Old English poem that we read. Um, And so, one of those things is going to be kennings. We're going to see kennings again. One of the more famous ones is Whale Road, but there's more. Feel free to look around. There's also going to be alliterative verse. This is going to be written in alliterative verse again. That's going to be the form with caesura. Basically, what we're going to see here is this is going to be affecting like the meter, and then we have, if and I put the Old English form on here so you could kind of see the way that the consonants at the beginning or the consonant sounds at the beginning of the words. If you look at them, we're going to have a lot of repetition. Okay. Um, and there's also going to be this huge gap right in the middle. And so and I keep pointing like as if you can see, that is going to be where the line is broken in the middle, right? The caesura. Okay, and I also included a link to this if you want to see it side by side, the original Old English with a more contemporary translation. That might be kind of interesting to compare them. So looking at what type of poem this is, it's an epic, right? We have this like heroic tale. It's long. We're getting a lot of details about his life and things like that. But in terms of, some of the tone does feel like it has with it the Anglo-Saxon, elegiac tone of melancholy and isolation and, retribution. And it's just kind of like there's like a darkness, a sadness, a melancholy that does permeate the text in several places. And so if you were reading it and you were like, wow, that's dark. Yes, right. It does have some optimism, which we're going to discuss in a second, but definitely also that melancholy. Okay, so back to the tone. Is this a Christian text, right? And I'll just say when I was originally taught Beowulf way back when in high school, I remember my teacher telling me that this was an Anglo-Saxon, poem that had been passed down through the oral tradition, and that later Christians had gotten a hold of it and put in a bunch of Christian stuff. And it really seems like that's not the consensus really much at all anymore. I mean, I'm not sure it was, but our textbook does kind of present things that way. So it must be part of what people still believe, scholars still believe. So it says the story, this is from the textbook, the story records the past glories of the warrior culture within a barely Christian framework to justify preserving the story, right? And so you're putting Christianity in there so that, you can kind of get away with all of this Anglo-Saxon cultural, this Germanic cultural content, right, and values. But then if I'm looking at other sources like Britannica or the Norton Anthology, Britannica says the poem is so infused with Christian spirit that it lacks the grim fatality of many of the Eddaic lays or sagas of Icelandic literature. And so here, this is what I was kind of referring to with like the optimism. It's not quite optimistic. I mean, I wouldn't say that. That's an overstatement even. It's not optimistic, but it does have maybe a different sense of like morality or good and evil or hope, maybe, than some of the other traditions that we would see within like sort of a Germanic tradition of heroic storytelling. And then finally, the Norton says, it is now widely believed that Beowulf is the work of a single poet who was a Christian and that his poem reflects well-established Christian ideals. So that we're getting less and less nuance, right? And so that does seem to be much more common in terms of what people believe. Okay, so let's look at this Germanic heroic epic, though, because I do want to talk about what we see in Beowulf that shows us some of the, historical culture and things like that. One of the things that I want to point out is this idea of Wehrgilt, and I wonder if you've heard about this, or if you kind of picked this up in the story, but basically, this translates from Old English to man payment, which I love that literal translation. And basically, the idea here is that if you kill someone or injure them, then you have to compensate their family, or you have to compensate someone for that person's death or injury. And so, for example, um, we see when Hrothgar's men are killed, he's really upset about it, right? And one of the things I wanted to kind of point out about that is that he's not just upset because he's lost these people. He's also upset because he isn't capable of killing Grendel. And so that aspect of this, the Veregild, that's about men, I guess. And so not necessarily applying to monsters, but the idea here is that you would be responsible for getting revenge on someone if they did not compensate you for death, for a person's death, right? And so he's supposed to kill Grendel, and he can't. And so he's ashamed, as well as, upset and scared. Revenge is going to be central to Germanic heroic tradition. And so if we look at Beowulf, you might notice that that's really present here. There's a lot of revenge. But the way that they're able to kind of get away with all of this revenge and not offend a Christian ideology, Christian audience, right? Is that the people that Beowulf is killing here are monsters, right? They're not people. And so it's a dragon. It's Grendel. He's a monster, right? And so it's okay. Nobody's going to be offended. Okay, and then in Germanic culture, one of the other things I wanted to point out is that in this culture, there's this idea that the relationship between the Thane and his lord is like the most important relationship in a person's life, like in his life, right? And it's kind of the ideal relationship because it's not like a servant kind of a role. It's not like a Thane tells you what to do and you do it. It's supposed to be a mutually supportive and respectful relationship. And it's voluntary. And so that's just kind of something to keep in mind when you're thinking about this story. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to the wife's lament. It was kind of difficult to pick which Anglo-Saxon poem we should read because they all are going to be doing kind of similar things. And the reason I ended up choosing The Wife's Lament is because I knew I wanted to pair it with Beowulf because there is some sort of like conjecture that this woman, I mean, there's an assumption that this woman was she left her family to go marry someone who lives somewhere else, right? Like in a faraway place. And so she feels isolated from her family. And people kind of have compared this to, or even thought maybe this was an example of the type of marriage, alliance marriage that we would see in Beowulf, for example. And in Beowulf, when women would be married in this way to form some sort of alliance or kind of a peace between families or to kind of bandage a feud, basically. It ended in Beowulf, it ends with violence. It's unsuccessful. They all end up dying, right? Because apparently that's not how you solve a feud. Um, but looking at this poem for what it is just on its own, it is part of the Exeter book. And if you want to read or look at the pages of the Exeter book, or if you know Old English, read it, you can click on this link and look at the actual pages. It's digitized if you want to look at the manuscript. And we know that it's probably, it's composed between 960 and 990. Now, that is when the surviving manuscript is from. And like Beowulf, we don't know the author, and we don't know um, how old this poem really is. We know when it was written down. And so just kind of keep that in mind. We're doing our best here. It's one of only two Old English elegies told from a woman's perspective, at least that we have. And then the other thing to kind of note about this that I think makes it fun is that the meaning of this poem is disputed at almost every level. Like if you look at line analysis of this poem, you can see that people really disagree with like literally almost line by line with every single line's meaning. In terms of language and form, so again, this is written in alliterative verse using a caesura, and it's using kennings. And so again, we're going to find examples of kennings. One of the interesting ones here is earth hall, which is going to be translated in different ways based on interpretation. Okay. And then I wanted to talk too about this idea of Anglo-Saxon poetry, which is going to have sort of a form of sort of the tone of an elegy. So it's kind of hard because we're really talking specifically about Anglo-Saxon elegies or Anglo-Saxon poetry, which is considered elegiac, maybe. Like that's the adjective. People do kind of say maybe these aren't elegies. Maybe that's not a great categorization, but mostly they're referred to as elegies. So I'm going to go with it. So these are secular poems evoking a poignant sense of desolation and loneliness, and their descriptions of the separation of lovers, the sorrows of exile, or the terrors and attractions of the sea. I think this is these poems are an interesting place where we can see how all of the migration going on at this time and wars and dis changes in power and things like that are going to be affecting people on a personal level probably because it's reflected in this melancholy, in these narrators who seem to be so alone, and lost. So, okay, let's think about the meaning of this poem though. And I am curious what you think because people do really disagree what this poem means. Some people say that the woman's husband basically like abandoned her and she's cursing him at the end of the poem. Some people say that the man she's referring to isn't her husband, which is interesting. Some people say maybe she's a ghost writing from a grave, and that's what the earth cave really means, or whatever, earth hall or whatever. Um, and yeah, so there's a few different ways of interpreting this, more than a few. And if you're curious about learning more about that, I would recommend reading different translations of the poem because the way that the poem is written is going to depend on the translator's interpretation. And so if you're reading it and you're like, well, it's obviously like she sympathizes with her husband and they're separated and it's so sad, you're probably reading a translation by somebody who believes that that's the right interpretation, right? And so just kind of keep that in mind. Different interpretations, different translations are going to have different interpretations. One thing that we can kind of know is we can compare this to other Anglo-Saxon poetry, and then we can learn a little bit more about what it probably the interpretation is. And so there isn't a comparable poem about a ghost writing from a grave, and so that one's been kind of dismissed. Although I've seen it pop up a few times as like a kind of a fringe theory, so I'm not so sure that it's totally dismissed. If you want to learn more about Old English poetry, I thought that Britannica had a really nice write-up about it, and so it's a nice overview. It's really, really well put, and so I would recommend reading this. There's definitely a lot more written on the internet if you want to read it, and you can always follow my links if you want to learn more about like the Exeter book or whatever. All right, that's it for this week. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next time.